Hello, everybody. It's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. Thought I would do a follow-up video to the last one. The last one was about the playable races of the Savage Kingdoms world and game in general. That was 12 human cultures that was covered in like I don't know, what was it, 40 minutes? Something like that. So today should be a little bit shorter because we're going to cover the playable non-human races of Savage Kingdoms 3 and the original editions as well and Reforged. So, as I prefaced in the last video, I think I mentioned it, that non-human races are actually optional because some people want a more pure sword and sorcery based game. Savage Kingdoms is loosely based in sword and sorcery, or I wouldn't say loosely, it's I guess fairly firmly, but there are some quasi high fantasy aspects of the setting as well. So people who prefer more of a pure sword and sorcery could just not allow non-human races for the player characters and just focus more on the rich human cultures. So my advice in the book is in the way I tend to do. Actually, I've been running it fairly open for my playtesters, but when I get a more focused sort of real campaign going, I follow my advice in the book, and that's to allow maybe one non-player or non-human per group of 4 or 5 players. Say if you have 7 or 8 players, maybe you allow 2 of them. And this is just to reflect the rarity of the races in general. So that's just some advice from the book. You don't have to use them at all, or you can just let it be completely open and let people play what they want. It's completely up to you as a game master. Okay, so let's go through these fairly quickly. These are, again, the playable player character races of Savage Kingdoms. Playable meaning that player characters can choose from these. All right, alphabetical order, starting with the Channari. It is pronounced Channari, by the way, not Shannari. I'm not sure where that's come from some of the people. I guess they think maybe it's a French word, and where the CH is pronounced like sh, but it's actually Channari. So Channari, Chenari. There are 2 types of Channari. The ones that appear in the Savage Kingdoms 3 book, although it's not completely fully edited. I may add the second version as well. Anyway, the one that appears currently are the Mezcan Channari. The Mezcan Channari, as the name implies, are from Mezca, which is, here's a crude but fairly decent map. Oh wait, it's not even. So the very top of Mezca is right there. In fact, this bottom of the paper, the reason it's lined up like this is the equatorial line. That's the equator of the world sphere, or the planet that the Savage Kingdom's known world is set upon. So as you can see, the equatorial line runs right through Mezca, almost right through. There's a little bit more to it at the bottom. Anyway, the Mezcan Channari are from there. The Channari are a cat-like race. They are the Mezcan Channari in particular are more jaguar-like in aspects, sort of jaguar. And they have adapted more to climbing in the jungles. They tend to be slightly smaller than the other type of Channari, which I'm about to get to. So yeah, they come from Mezca. The primary deity of the Channari is Amrashi. Amrashi is sort of, and he's more revered really by the other Channari. He's a god of, he's basically their creator god. He's a god of war and hunting. Yeah, he's looked at, he could be either gender, but he's looked at particularly mostly as male, as masculine. The secondary deity that's almost as popular, actually probably is as popular in Mezca, or she is Shamanta. Shamanta is more of a feminine goddess. She is a goddess of birth and growth and healing. So, of the Channari people. So those are the Mezcan Channari. They are a cat-like race, again, more like sort of jaguars or pumas. The other Channari subrace, if I include them in the Savage Kingdoms core rulebook, if I don't, they'll still be on the Savage East, which is the following book. They are the Imanjian Channari, and they are called Imanjian because they're from the continent of Imanju, which I don't have handy. Here is a map. Anyway, actually, I'll try to find it as I'm rambling on in one of the old Savage Kingdoms Reforged books. So Imanju is an African-inspired continent, as some of you who know the game probably already know. I pulled the maps out of that book. Anyway, we'll just go with it. Anyway, I was going to show you a map. So they are from the eastern part of the world, the southern hemisphere of the eastern part of the world. So really, they're kind of from the south, the southern continent, as it were. But it's still, east latitorially speaking. So Chinari's African-inspired. The Imanju. So the Chinari that come from Imanju, and at one point they were pretty clearly, obviously, one race, and then they kind of split off. It's said that the Imanjian Chinari were first, probably, and according to some of their lore and scholars, they managed to find a way. They figured out how to build reed boats out of reed, and they floated across, and they started exploring a little bit, and they came across the Isle continent of Mezca, and that's how the Mezcan Chinari kind of separated and sort of evolved, so to speak, into their own thing, being slightly smaller than the Imanjian Chinari and adapted more to climbing. So, to the Imanjian Chinari, they remained sort of in the main continent of Imanju. They ranged a little bit far, but they didn't really go too far. And they did settle a couple large, fairly known kingdoms now called Amrar and Chanashi. Amrar and Chanashi. And if I had that map ready, I would show it to you, but you just have to trust me. Or if anybody has the old book, just look at the continent of Amanju, and you'll see Amrar and Chanashi on there. There were probably other smaller tribal realms at some point, but those are the two that have kind of survived as we're now clearly into the age of man, where humankind is sort of starting to dominate now, and these races that you're still allowed to play for Game Master allows you to are becoming almost more legendary, like beings of legend. But as for right now, they still exist, and you can play them as player characters. So, and another note about the Imanjian Chinari is they are more lion-esque. They're more lion-like manes of hair, and some people have asked me how anthropomorphic are the Chinari. They're pretty, very much so. So if you're thinking, some people are envisioning them, because I haven't had some art that's really showed them that well. A lot of players envision them, and perhaps rightly so, as just kind of giant cats, and that's not really the truth. I mean, think more anthropomorphic, think more humanoid body form, some cat-like features, and the way I'm envisioning, they're not even like specifically like a cat head on a human body. It's almost like it's a humanoid face, but they're feline features. There's definitely like hair like fur like hair. And I envision the manes, almost their mane, kind of a lot of their manes are worn in dreadlocks, by the way, in the Amanjian, depending on the tribe. And they do have claws, and I'm thinking they're retractable. I don't think I've ever really said that they are or not. It doesn't really matter, but they do get a claw attack, game mechanically speaking, which is kind of cool. They're very athletic in general. The Amanjians, particularly, are probably more warlike than the Mezcan Chinari. So that's the Chinari, the cat folk. I guess one last note on them before I move on is that they are, even though one part of them, and perhaps both subraces of Chinari, might be included in the core rulebook, which covers the western part of the world, the continent of Astagonia. Despite that fact, the Chinari actually are from the east, because, like I said, they originated in the continent of Imanju. So why didn't you include them in the Savage East, one might ask? Well, because I wanted a cat-like race, because I like cats, in the core rulebook, and I know that a lot of players, particularly women, like to play like cat-like anthropomorph. Oh, now I suddenly can't say it. Cat-like races. So, so I just thought we would throw them in there because the next two races are somewhat generic, but perhaps not so. So moving on to, in alphabetical order, like I said, number 2 would be Duergar. So the Duergar, or Durgar, some people say, I've actually looked up the Nordic pronunciation of, and either is actually is correct. It just kind of depends on what part of the region, but it is a Scandinavian rooted word, Germanic word. Duergar seems to be the most prominent pronunciation. So Duergar is just a term for dwarf. So the Duergar are the dwarves of the Savage Kingdoms world. Some of you probably already know this, but for those of you who do not, there it is. The Duergar are dwarves. They don't really like to be called dwarves because dwarf is sort of a term for like a stunted growth human. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but the dwarves don't necessarily like to be compared to that. Some will just kind of let it slide. Others are very, because Dorg are they're very prideful. They're very honor based, and they can they're very decent people, but they can be moved to violence fairly quickly. So if they don't want to be called dwarves, maybe don't call them dwarves. So it's Duergar. But yeah, dwarf. Some will let you get away with it. They are the typical dwarf or Duergar. They're bearded. They're short for overall. They're not quite as short as in some settings. They actually come in more around 4.5 to 5 feet tall instead of like 4 to 4.5. Stocky, sturdy. So given the fact that they're not as super short as some people think, and they're very stocky, they weigh easily as much as most humans do. Bearded, like I said, they go by clan names. Some famous clan names are Ironbeard, Flame Fist, Golden Axe, etc. Frost Axe. Um, so yeah, their naming schematics are probably fairly generic fantasy. I would completely admit nothing completely fancy there. There are two realms of Duergar that still exist in the west that are pretty well known. That's Thrymnor. Where's it at? Thrymnor and Olderak. Thrymnor and Olderak, if you wish to say it in a dwarven accent. Um, which I don't really use Scottish for that, by the way, because that's the thing now. But I like to use more of a German accent for Duergar. But then that gets like Arnold, who's awesome, but then it becomes a laugh. So portray them as you would voice acting wise. Maybe I don't know. Maybe a tinge of Scottish would be about right. Just make sure it's deep and earthy, whatever it is, if you're doing a Duergar accent, because they do resonate deep in the earth. Right. So Thrymnor and Olderak. There's another small clan down here in the Golden Mountains, in the middle of the Laurentian Empire, but it's dwindled. It was a dwarven sort of realm or kingdom at one point. Now it's just kind of a fairly small holding. They were almost practically enslaved by the Laurentians, actually, to mine gold out of the aptly named Golden Mountains. So a nice little historical note. They're not so much indentured anymore. They've kind of gained their freedom, but what else can I say about the Duergar? They're fairly normal fantasy trope. The only differences would be like the name of some of the realms or whatever, and how they fit in the setting. The Duergar seem to have sprung into being in the Age of Giants. Interesting enough, which is over 10,000 years ago. Um, some believe they might have been created in the Age of Gods, which is even earlier. Some say it was actually later in the Age of Fairy, but they don't like to be associated with the age of the fairy folk. So it's fairly largely agreed upon that they were created, at least going back in their own annals of history, that they were created sometime 10 to 12,000 years ago. Some say they were created earlier, like I said, and lay dormant deep in the mountains, and were only animated by their creator gods later on in life for the perfect time for them to come forth. Presented itself. So their main deities are Duradin. Duradin is a god of craft and smiths. So very much a earth and fire god, forging things deep in the earth. The other god nearly as potent and popular would be Baldak. Baldak is a war god. He's actually probably more prominent in Olderak, and in the realm of Thrymnor, Duradin is probably slightly more prominent. It's a Baldak, god of war, battle, not bottles, battle. Um, there are some other minor Duergar deities as well, but those are by far the two most. There's actually a female goddess, that's kind of redundant, named Thrymna, which is, some people say, is where Thrymnor took its name from. So she is responsible for having stolen fire from the gods and brought the secret to the fire. Although some people say Duradin did it, but others say that Thrymna did it. And she's also known as Drawn in some parts of the world. Although some people say it might be a different deity. But anyway, a nice little note. I like to keep, as you probably noticed, the theme here. Even in the lore, we like to keep Savage Kingdoms fairly open and mysterious to some degree. I think some RPGs, just to get on a side note really quick, some RPGs, particularly in fantasy, get too sciencey. It's like, that's literally what this is, and this creature falls into this category, and this, it's like, that's well and good for 80% of the time, 70% of the time, but don't do that all the time, because then it becomes sciencey. It's like I don't, sometimes when games describe their magic system and everything is, it's like, it's not magic anymore. It's science. You've got this whole scientific thing, the way it works. Some of that's cool because I like to explain how magic in general works as well, or sorcery, but I think you'll do better if you leave some of it open-ended and very mysterious. And even the magicians and sorcerers themselves don't really know what's, they're like, I just learn to do it this way, and it happens. I don't really know. Some people worship a deity and get power. Others just learn some formulas from an old book. That one person learned to do rituals and just kind of on the fly, and the spell produced itself as well. Which is why you make a skill roll, a magical arts skill roll in the game, because it's not always guaranteed to work. So, side note. All right, I think that's enough about the Duergar. Yeah, so number 3. Playable race number 3 of the non-humans would be the She, and the She are divided into 3 subtypes or subraces. She is spelled Sidhe. The word is not, I didn't make it up, the word comes from Celtic mythology. Some of you are probably already familiar with it. So if you, in Gaelic, an SI is pronounced like an SH, she. So it's pronounced she. I mean, it's not, some parts of Ireland actually do pronounce it like she, but it's she seems to be the most prominent pronunciation. That's kind of what we use in Savage Kingdoms, but whichever. So, but just know it's pronounced she and not Sidhe or anything crazy like that, even though it's kind of spelled that way. The She are also elves. So, in fact, in the north, they're often called the Elfa, or the elves. And but in most of the rest of the world, they are called the She, as they prefer to be called. They're divided into the Dark She, the Aluna She, and the Wild She in alphabetical order. So the Dark She are dark elves. So they are fairly standard dark elves, not Drow. I don't think Drow D&D. They're definitely not. They're more, their skin tone is fairly pale, actually, but I did describe some of them have gained a grayish pallor, as if almost to be. So sometimes they're even called shadow elves for that reason, but not much. Don't think like dark gray or like drow coloration. It's a little bit lighter than that, or however you want it. But that's just kind of the way they're described. They typically, I've kind of gone back and forth. My original vision of the dark elves or the dark she were white or silvery hair, almost like the drow in D&D. And then I was like, it's a little. So now I have it where some of them have that, but others have very black hair, and that's kind of another reason they might be called the dark she or dark elves. They split apart from, so basically back in history of Savage Kingdoms, about 3,200 years ago, so well over 3,000 years ago, 3 millennia ago, where humans were still living in caves, learning to start fires and hunting mammoths and other such nonsense for survival. So not nonsense, so very important actually. There was a great elven empire, an elven realm called Arvelindor, which means realm of beautiful song and the She tongue. And so it existed in this part of the world right here. It was this pretty large empire that ran from this forest of Kelanathian down to the Twilight Forest. And there was forest all in between. As you can see, there's now the Shadowlands there, and there was a reason for that. So Arvelindor had a great rebellion. 2 of the noble houses kind of split apart, the royal house and one that was kind of vying for royalty. And so they fought with one another, and there was a huge war called the Shadow War. As we look back, I think it lasted, I forgot what I wrote, I think it's 5 or 7 years. There's an odd number somewhere in there. I think it's 5 years. So back in the time, magic was more powerful, and the She, know how to wield sorcery and magic to a great degree. They were pulling out all the stops back then. I mean, it got, as historians will now tell you, that the battles between the people that are the closest, like the American Civil War, is weirdly tend to be the most bloody because there's more emotion involved. So this is how it was in the Battle of Arvelindor, the Shadow War, because they were, his brother and brother are fighting essentially, or cousin and cousin, kinsman and kinsman. And so they were pulling out magic was more powerful, and they were uttering these incredible spells. And long story short, it split it's called the Breaking of Arvalindor for a reason. When you look back on it, the bards sing the Breaking of Arvalindor, and it shattered that realm of Arvalindor and created Calenduril and Lithalor. So Calenduril in the north is where the Alunashi retreated to, the Light Elves, which I'll get to in a second, and the Dark She kind of retreated into a slightly smaller area, which is now Lithalor. And Lithalor is kind of tucked into the shadows of the Bloodrock Mountains and the Shadowwood and the Twilight Forest down there, and it's reducing, but Calenduril is also reducing. The Shi in general are in a time of fading, sort of a la Tolkien, Lord of the Rings era. They're kind of in a fading, maybe not quite to that degree, but they tend to be very insular now. They don't range much. It's rare to encounter a Shi merchant party or even a lone Shi wandering in the world, but not impossible because that's where our player characters typically come from. So that's the Dark Shi. They are kind of like they're very proud. They're not super into humans. They think humankind is a completely lower rung of evolution, and maybe they're not entirely wrong. Maybe they're not entirely right. Um, so if you look at their code of honor system in the racial entry of the book, you'll see code, their general racial code of honor, and it actually mentions that. So yeah, so that's the Lithalorians or the Dark Shi. Not all Dark Shi are Lithalorians, so they don't all come from Lithalor. There's still a few. Might find a scattered tribe or even a tiny hidden kingdom somewhere, but for the most part, I would say if you were rolling randomly to see where you came from as a Dark Shi, I'd say 90%, 93% chance you'd be from Lithalor. So, subrace number 2 of the Shi would be the Eluna Shi. Eluna. So, Eluna Shi. The Eluna Shi are, if you were to translate that from Elf to Shi, or Elvish into English in the real world, what we're speaking in right now, it would mean light elves, or it also means first elves, or the primal ones, the first elves, the first people. But some people translate it as light elves. Either works because that word in ancient Shi really means actually the means the same thing, because the Eluna Shi actually believe light came first. The Dark Shi believe that darkness came first, and so that's a whole philosophical differential. The Eluna are like I would say, high elves of Dungeons and Dragons. So they're very high elfy, higher ideals. In a literal sense of Savage Kingdoms, there were several elven or Shi cities that were floated. There were sky cities in the air that were a mile up in the kingdom of Calenduril. In the current age, it is said, because most people don't know for sure, they don't rarely go in there to that forest, that most of the cities, if not all of them, have crashed. They're now on the ground. They didn't plummet and crash and kill everyone, but they slowly lost their buoyancy, so to speak, over time. Legend has it they were fueled. They were able to fly from things called windstones. They were these big stones called windstones that had great air magic. They were built back in an age again where magic was more potent, more powerful, to be almost impossible to duplicate nowadays. Not impossible, but very nearly impossible. And you would have to have several installed in the city in order to bring it back in the air. But apparently the cities continue on. The elves or Shis continue to live on them, even though they're on the ground. They're still these beautiful kind of citadel tower cities. So if you think traditional fantasy art, high elven cities, you've probably got the right idea here as well. So those are the Eluna. They're very gifted with the magic, just as Dark Shi. They're both, game mechanically speaking, they both get magic affinity as a free talent, which is pretty good because that's a 4-point talent. Allows you to use all 7 disciplines of magic if you want. So they're already naturally born with it. It's up to you to put skill points in it or not, or you can just leave it, not developed, and it makes sense. But Eluna Shi, what else can I mention about them? I think it's really about it. The Dark Shi are gifted with magic as well. They both have starsight. They see well in the dark. The Dark Shi a little bit better, so the Eluna Shi actually tend to see a little further. They see twice as far as humans do, which is kind of nice. You can pick up on more details, and you can also use the famous quote from Lord of the Rings, "Legolas, what do your elf eyes see?" Hopefully you don't literally name every she character Legolas. But Dark She and Aluna She. Next, the third subrace would be the Wild She. Wild She. And you might think, surely they don't call themselves that. Well, they don't really mind they're being called Wild She. They think it's, some of them think it's kind of an honor. Some believe maybe it's a little slap in the face that they're savages. But they live, as the name implies, they live wilder in the world. They have not made the choice between the Aluna and Dark. They just kind of stay away from that. These would have represented when Arvalindor, during the breaking of Arvalindor and the Shadow War, these would represent tribes that just probably stayed out of the battle and sort of just left, fled the area. It was nonsense. The terrible magics created the Shadowlands, which is now all blighted. So the wild she scattered into various other, and they do still prefer forest realms. Down in Laurenthian Empire in the Elderwood Forest, it's kind of neat because there's a couple of tribes left, not many, but they've been almost at open war with the Laurenthians for a while, which is really bad because the Laurenthians would outnumber them like 100 to 1. But the elves are so used to their woodland realm, and they're still so gifted in magic and woodcraft that they can kind of hold their own, especially in the forest, where Laurenthians are not quite as used to it. They're a little more urbane. And then other tribes fled north into the Kimbrethi forest is there, the Blackheart forest and the Greywood forest. And some have been found all the way as far north as Scathia. Scathia and the Giant Wood, and perhaps even further north still, where sometimes they're called frost elves or ice elves or snow elves. Uh, many didn't go very south. It's almost like the Shi are more adapted to temperate to subarctic climates, but they can probably do well in the subtropics as well. The wild Shi are also notably different. They paint themselves in tribal patterns. They almost all have body art. A lot of it's very intricate because being elves or Shi, they're very into the very artistic. They also live much longer than humans. All the Shi do, so they have time to do all these incredible detail. That's why their arts and crafts, when they really focus, can be incredible. And the same with the Duergar. I didn't really cover that. The Duergar, they can live it to about 300 years, 250 to 300 years. Chernari live about, going back to Chernari, they live a little less than human, but only by like 10 or 15 years, so it's fairly close. So they typically, on average, die around the age of 60 or so, 65. Duergar would, like I said, 250 to 300 years. The Shi can live 350 to sometimes 400 years, 450. And instead of dying, they tend to, and this is very Tolkien, I did this on purpose because he's awesome. They tend to retreat to the other world before they die. And she do not show physical age very much until like really late into the years, like past 300 or so. And then they just sort of know when it's time to either fade away or die, or they try to find a portal to the other world where they can retire there, which is their native realm, actually, the other world, as we call it, also known as the shadow world or the mirror world. The wild Shi, I think it's about it about them. They just live a little wilder and looser and savage, and they live in tribes. They don't have these big kingdoms anymore. Perhaps they learned the lesson of Arvalindor. So number 4. The Sleer, the bad boys of Savage Kingdoms. Well, some of them. The Sleer are serpent folk. You can probably tell by their name, Sleer, spelled Sslir. There are 3 types of them, just like the Shi. They're the golden, the green, and the red. Now, legend has it there was a 4th one called the Black Shi. Some people even call them the Blue Shi. And a shout out to some of my Savage Kids gamers who actually had the idea of Blue Shi, and I already had sort of an idea of a 4th one, and we kind of blended it together. So yeah, we're kind of working on that. So shout out to the kids who came up with that cool idea that I might be blending with the legendary, that they're a Black Shi original. And the reason they're called that, so the Shi, the serpent folk, picture them as they have black scales, almost all of them. When they're born in the world, they have black scales. But very quickly after being born, they develop patterns and colors. So the golden Sleer are called that because it's gold on black. And the best way I describe their patterns is look at Darth Maul's face from the Star Wars, and the pattern. That's kind of what it looks like. He's black with the red. So that imagine that sort of pattern, or like a salamander type pattern would be for the Sleer. The Golden Sleer, the noble caste. The Sleer have a caste-based system, meaning that when you're born into that, you pretty much stuck there for the most part. There's maybe a 1% chance you can move, like a green or red Sleer can move up to nobility, but it's really, really rare, and you're probably going to end up getting killed if you become too powerful. So the Golden Sleer are basically the noble caste, which means they also become priests and sorcerers the most, and alchemists. In other words, the mystical arts in general. They There's a serpent god named Slur. Slur is the best way we humans can pronounce it, which many scholars believe became Zur or Zur when the Zarkonians started worshiping a serpent god that seemed to be very, very much like the Slerian god Slur. So Slur, Zur sounds very similar. They're both these big serpent gods. The Sleer taught mankind a lot of their knowledge of city building, particularly pyramid building and stuff. This is in the East. This is the Eastern realm. So the Sleer, even though again they show up in the core rule book representing the Astagonian continent, they are actually from the East. They are from what's called the Old Empire, and its name would be Isrith, but they usually just call the Old Empire. In fact, if you translate Sleer into what we're speaking, it would literally mean Old Empire, Isrith. So yeah, Slur is a big serpent god. He's even described as so massive that he is the darkness. His eyes are the two moons of the world, and the red sun is sometimes seen his mouth, and sometimes another body part, which you'll read in the uh, yeah, which you'll read in the book. So maybe I'll change that lore. Although I kind of like it because it's kind of gritty sword and sorcery. But anyway, so that's Slur. But no one knows. Maybe it doesn't exist at all. Maybe he's just a tiny snake. Maybe more likely if he's such a powerful deity that he can take any shape he wants to and kind of look like whatever. Maybe perhaps he literally is the darkness. Perhaps all the snakes in the world are his spawn, and that is actually one of the Slerian beliefs. So the Golden Sleer are, so they're mostly the mystical noble caste. They rule. They're the ones that kind of have the market, the monopoly on the mystical arts, including alchemy as well, because alchemy and magical arts, the way I created it, alchemy is kind of like your alchemy in Conan. It's quasi-scientific, but it's also quasi-magical. The Sleer look at it really much more as just an extension of sorcery, of the magical arts. So next is the Green Sleer. So the Green Sleer are actually the hunter. They're the hunter caste. So they're hunters and scouts and assassins. So they're pretty important. The Sleer are pretty much I wouldn't say evil necessarily, although some of them very much can be. But they're definitely a little underhanded. They're definitely not the good chivalric people, and almost it'd be really rare. So they're very underhanded. So they will use assassination's a fairly normal thing. So the Green Sleer are born into that. They have the power. They have chameleon power, by the way. Their skin like blends into the environment, which is really cool. So they get a big bonus on stealth. The Golden Slayer, by the way, I forgot to mention, they can shapeshift and look like humans, look like humanoids, and blend right in with society. And that's apparently how they intermingled with human society for a long time back in the East, and how they still do it when they've come to the West. So that's the Slayer. Both of them have a poison spittle, like a acidic poison that they can spit out. It's pretty nasty. It does damage, kind of acidic poison damage, kind of both. Um, However, the next cast of Sleer is the Red Sleer. The reason I say, however, they have a bite. They actually do not have poison glands, but they have a very vicious bite. They have really strong jaws, and they can deal damage with just their teeth, their snake-like teeth. And the Red Sleer are the warrior caste. So they are the warrior caste. So they are, the red on black, whereas the Green Sleer are the green on black as far as their scale pattern goes. When I say scales, the scales are very subtle. They're like snake skin and not dragon skin. So that's why they don't have any natural armor bonuses, natural protection ratings. So yeah, the Red Sleer, the warrior caste, they typically are built slightly larger. They can typically grow a little bit larger, not always, but You could be pretty muscular. So I think their physique can go up to +6, I believe, if I recall. Yeah, and the green slayer can go up to +6 agility, I believe, and the golden slayer up to +6 intellect and magnetism, I think. So just to cover all that really quickly. The slayer noted kind of for interesting weapons, a bladed whip, known as a Kurthra. There's a Nothra, which is a bladed, it's actually not named in the book, we just kind of came up with that on the fly, but it follows the linguistic pattern that I established. They're like throwing wedges. Like think of a giant shuriken with like 3 blades, and they actually come back to you, not exactly, but within 3 yards of you, unless you critically fail. One of my kid players actually got an enchanted one that actually returns to him or her, the character's female, like every time. So that's kind of cool. So even if he misses. So what else can I mention? Bladed whip. They have a bladed shield, which is kind of cool. So they have some very interesting weapons. Even their normal sword type weapons are usually serrated and slightly curved, and they just like to do tearing, ripping damage, and they're very they're very torture based race and sort of nasty. The Slayer enslaved mankind in the East actually for about a millennium, for about 1,000 years. Not all humans, obviously, but very, very much most of them. Most of them, the what we would consider the Middle East of our world, where a lot of the human cultures were kind of developing. The Slayer brought goodness and badness to them. They enslaved people, which is obviously bad. But over time, as humans became more prolific and they produced offspring quicker than the Slayer, they began to sort of overtake the Slayer, and they finally threw off their shackles in most areas. They kind of broke the shackles of bondage, but they used what the Slayer taught them actually to build these cities. So places like Zarkon and Ar and even Zaramad in the east, and that's in the Savage East. That'll be a whole different thing. Developed very quickly because a lot of it because the Slayer gave them this some knowledge of architecture and magic and sorcery and alchemy and that sort of thing. So I think that's it. That is actually all 4, really, if you look at it, 9, if you break down the different subclasses of the non-playable, or the not of the playable races and the Savage Kingdoms 3 core rulebook. So thanks you guys for listening. Hopefully that helps you out with how the races are structured and some of the background. And I'll probably do another one of these videos pretty soon. And by the way, thanks for sponsoring the Indiegogo campaign. We're already we made our goal. We're at like 120% now, I think, which is cool. Let's keep it going though, because I did set it really low. So the more we get, we can even do better art and stuff and have a really cool graphic presentation of the book. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. And I will talk